Sanibonani Mzansi. I am your host Candice Kumalo and I welcome you to another episode of the Health from Mzansi podcast. As you know, it's Africa Month and this entire month was dedicated to celebrating our African cultures, traditions, and yes, even foods that make our continent so vibrant. Joining me to discuss why incorporating indigenous foods in our diet is important is Dr. Ethel Phiri, who specializes in researching about indigenous and underutilized crops with an interest in sustainable food systems.
Thank you, Candice, and thank you for inviting me to this podcast. I am Ethel Phiri, or Dr. E, as many call me. I am a lecturer and researcher at Stellenbosch University. I am the academic lead for the master's program in sustainable agriculture, but I also lecture sustainable plant production and protection. And my research is on indigenous and underutilized crops. So their cultivation, their nutritional value, as well as their characterization.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, Dr. E. So can you just define what indigenous underutilized foods are?
Indigenous crops or foods, those that are native to a particular region and have been cultivated or consumed by indigenous or local communities for generations. Underutilized crops, on the other hand, are those that have not been widely adopted or commercialized. And this is often due to factors such as limited knowledge about their nutritional value or lack of market demand. However, Africa boasts a rich diversity of indigenous foods that have sustained communities for generations, and these include sorghum, millets, including pearl and finger millet, bambara groundnut, cowpea, amaranth, cassava, okra, amongst others. I know that some of your listeners might not know these by their English names, but they might know them by their traditional names. But that's just a few examples of indigenous and underutilized crops of the continent.
So in a nutshell, what would you say are the unique qualities that indigenous food has?
Indigenous and underutilized crops or foods often possess unique qualities such as high nutritional value, resilience to local environmental conditions. Some of them are resistant to pests and resilient to climate change. And some tend to have the ability to grow with minimal inputs, so minimal fertilizers that are needed for most commercial crops. They also have cultural significance for the communities that cultivate them.
So Dr. E, can you just unpack why you would say it's important then to include indigenous food in our diets?
Including indigenous foods in our diet can help promote biodiversity, meaning that currently we are mostly reliant on three major staple crops, those being maize, wheat, and rice. So if we include indigenous foods in our diets, we can promote biodiversity and diversifying our diets. We can support local economies and preserve traditional knowledge and cultural practices. And these foods are often nutritious and contribute to a more diverse and sustainable food system.
I'm building on what you just said, Dr. E. I'm curious to know the specific health benefits associated with regular consumption of indigenous foods.
So there's limited research that has been conducted on the health benefits of many indigenous crops, but some of those that have been researched have been found to be often rich in nutrients and bioactive compounds, which may provide various health benefits. For example, many indigenous fruits and vegetables are high in antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, which can help against chronic non-communicable diseases such as heart disease, cancer, and diabetes.
Dr. E, I'm eager to hear your perspective on barriers or challenges that indigenous communities face in maintaining and promoting traditional food systems. What are some challenges that are faced?
Indigenous communities face several challenges in maintaining and promoting their traditional food systems, and these include loss of traditional knowledge. A lot of the knowledge that is around indigenous foods is being held by our grandparents. And as our grandparents become old or they perish, then you find that that information also perishes. And the world is facing many challenges on land degradation. So we find that our land is no longer usable for agriculture. not only that, there's a lot of urbanization that is occurring, leaving rural areas devoid of people that can work in those agricultural land. And then there's also limited access to markets, and then competition from non-traditional foods. As I mentioned, the three main crops that we tend to eat being maize, wheat, and rice. There's that competition. So, for example, if we decided that we were going to eat sorghum pap instead of maize pap, then could be one of the ways that we try to tackle those variants and challenges.
So speaking of challenges, how can they be addressed to ensure the continued availability and accessibility of Indigenous foods?
It's important to support Indigenous communities in preserving their traditional knowledge, promoting sustainable agricultural practices, improving access to markets, and raising awareness about the traditional and cultural value of Indigenous foods. Raising awareness, I've found, is one of the bigger and most important addressing the challenges or way of addressing the challenges, because a lot of people, even our young African children, no longer know about their Indigenous food. So raising awareness would be one of the most important ways of addressing these challenges.
Dr. E, so in closing, how would you advise people to support the optimal access and utilization of Indigenous and underutilized food?
Individuals can support optimal access and the utilization of Indigenous food by learning about Indigenous food traditions and incorporate them into their diets. They can support local farmers and producers who grow Indigenous crops. They can advocate for policies that promote the conservation and sustainable use of Indigenous food sources. And also, as I mentioned previously, to raise awareness about the nutritional and cultural value of Indigenous foods in their communities.
Thank you for joining this week's episode of the Health from Mzansi podcast. To find out more about being the healthiest version of yourself, visit healthfromzansi.co.za. Or you can send us an email to hello@healthfromzansi.co.za. This is the Health from Mzansi podcast, and your ears are always invited. As Africa Month comes to an end, I hope you consider incorporating some Indigenous foods into your diet. Explore the unfamiliar, rediscover the forgotten, and let's celebrate the future of African Indigenous food together. By incorporating these nutritional powerhouses back into our meals, we're not just enriching our diets, but also keeping our culinary traditions alive. Stay healthy and fancy. I am your host, Candice Kumalo. Until next time.